The Nvidia GeForce RTX 3070 Ti is a mid-range graphics card launched in June of 2021. Yet despite this card being on the market for over a year, plenty of gamers are now just starting to get their hands on the new Ampere-based cards. This was for a variety of reasons. Crypto! Excuse me. But that still doesn't discount the fact that they're beyond fast for what most people use GPUs for. Let's discuss the 3070 Ti, a card that, besides the base 3070, is probably going to go down as one of the better value cards from this generation. Let's break it down from a technical perspective, and then jump into some games to see how said specs translate to real-world performance. Before I get into this video, I'd like to say not to forget to leave a comment if there's something you think I missed, or you'd like to add to this video. Anything from personal experience with the hardware to technical discussions are welcome, as I can't cover every aspect of a card in the duration of a video. Without any further ado, let's dig into the 3070 Ti. The actual card I'll be reviewing today is the Gaming OC flavor from Gigabyte. It's a triple slot, seemingly mid-range flavor of this model of card that's pretty overbuilt for the thermal dissipation required by the GPU on board. With 3 fans, a pass-through vent on the back, and open sides to allow air to circulate through the large heatsink, the heatsink on the card is beyond adequate to cool the 290 watts this card is rated to draw. It's got an assortment of heat pipes visible from the outside of the card, and just for reference, a similar cooling design is used on a Gigabyte 3080. So in all reality, this design was probably used to cool much higher TDP GPUs than what the 3070 Ti sports. During all the benchmarks and also during long compute sessions, the card never went above 80 Celsius, and while it may have hit that occasionally, it was very rare. The card usually hangs out around the 70 to 73 Celsius mark, and if you lock your FPS to 60, the temperatures just continue to drop from there. In terms of build quality, this card features sturdy construction that, while prone to sagging, isn't alarming to the point where I get nervous. The weight of the heatsink probably is why there's sag in the first place, but for the heft of this heatsink, it's a small price to pay. You've also got an accentuated RGB Gigabyte logo that, while cool, I generally keep turned off. In my opinion though, I think it's more tastefully done than something like my AIO, which you can see on screen, and it's nice to have the option to toggle it on and off. Moving into external display connectors, the card features 2 DisplayPort 1.4As and 2 HDMI 2.1 connectors. For what I use my system for, these connectors are more than satisfactory, and leave room to add additional monitors if I wanted to do so in the future. Keep in mind though that the Founders Edition actually features 3 DisplayPorts and a single HDMI, so it will vary from flavor to flavor. Just do a quick lookup in a spec database to make sure it will support what you want to use it for. This card also features 2 8-pin PCIe power connectors, and not one of those new 12-pin PCIe 5.0 components that are found on the Founders Editions. For the card's rated TDP of 290 watts, this allows for a little bit of headroom, but in total the card has the ability to draw a maximum of 375 watts from the connectors and motherboard. So for this model, you won't be pushing the card to crazy wattages, but you're given connectors that can comfortably supply the card with the power it's permitted to draw. That's kind of it in terms of our first look at the card. It's an attractive piece of tech for sure, but what I find more interesting is what's going on under the hood. The microarchitecture, kind of like Intel's Rocket Lake, actually has a pretty interesting story that might explain some of the architectural similarities between previous gen designs, but also some of the massive differences. The first thing that I remember catching almost everyone off guard was the doubling of CUDA cores over Turing. And while not all CUDA cores are created equal, the fact that the cards now deliver double the floating point power over the previous gen provides a theoretical massive bump to performance. To pull this off though, you're actually sacrificing one type of compute for another, and this is dynamically adjusted based on the operations going on within each SM. From a macro level, the layout of the SM within a compute block is relatively similar between Turing and Ampere. Where Ampere differs though is the so-called data paths that the individual cores are equipped with. Remember when I said that not all CUDA cores are created equal? Well, when looking at the Ampere diagrams, you can see that half the CUDA cores are labeled with FP32/IN32, while the other half are just labeled FP32. You've also got the tensor cores, load store and special function units, and the texture mapping units. The L1 cache in each Ampere SM has also increased to 128 kilobytes over Turing's 96 kilobytes. Turing's performance was, theoretically, in workloads that properly utilize the integer capabilities, almost double the performance per clock over Pascal. Turing did this by allowing the integer and floating point pipelines to be active and working on data simultaneously. In their white papers, they call it concurrent execution of floating point and integer instructions in the Turing SM, and this feature also returns for Ampere. What changes with Ampere though is the integer ALUs have also been paired with FPUs, meaning that you now have concurrent execution of either an int and FP instruction or two FP instructions across two CUDA cores. Notice though that there's always a core performing only floating point math, while the other can toggle between integer and floating point. This design decision, while I don't feel like it's truly doubling CUDA core counts, improves performance in games dramatically. If you've programmed for a GPU, chances are that you've done most of your mathematical calculations in some floating point value. Whether it's a float, a double, a half, or a B float, it requires a specialized FPU to operate on, and GPUs historically have just been giant banks of these specialized mathematical units. For things like image processing, which I personally have the most experience with, you'd be using integers, whose ALUs can be easily chained or subdivided to accommodate different size data types, and speed up performance without requiring all these specialized circuits like with FP numbers. For low bit depth integers though, you've also got the tensor cores. They're primarily marketed as FP16 matrix units, but they're capable of int8 and int4 as well. While I have extremely limited experience programming for them, their throughput for int8 matrix operations is top of the line in Ampere-based cards. You only get 4 of these specialized cores per SM, down from Turing's 8, but they're twice as wide in dense operations and 4 times as wide in sparse operations. Each core is capable of more instructions per clock and is also physically larger, which is probably why we saw an overall reduction in tensor core count with Ampere. The tensor cores in Ampere also introduced TensorFloat 32 and BFloat 16 compatibility. So if you're writing algorithms using TensorFlow or Torch, they'll see performance improvements on Ampere over Turing, even if the SM count hasn't really changed all that much. For games which these cards are targeted at, over half your operations are going to be some kind of floating point, meaning you'll get a performance improvement in areas that can utilize the extra FP16 power. Now, why did I compare this architecture to Intel's Rocket Lake? Well, if you remember Rocket Lake, it was a retrofitted design of a 10nm plus core onto 14nm+++ lithography. With it came some performance improvements and regressions, but over the previous generation 14nm native Skylake, it proves to be faster on average. Ampere, according to some sources that seem to line up relatively well and honestly make 100% sense, was apparently originally designed for TSMC's 7nm lithographic node. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, probably having to do with product volume, they went with a different design building upon a half node shrink of their previous gen's Turing, and tweaked the cores to get what we have in front of us. This explains the similar core layout between Turing and Ampere, and explains why they went with this weird int-FP switching on half the cores in an SM. It's not a perfect comparison to what Intel pulled off, but the similarities are definitely there. As for what this card specifically sports, let's dive into the core specs of the 3070 Ti. The die featured in this card is the 8nm fully unlocked GA104-400-A1 graphics processing unit. With the spec'd 6144 FP32 CUDA cores, the card delivers just under 22 teraflops of compute at the stock boost clock of 1770 MHz. Without tuning, the core in this specific flavor hits a consistent 1950 MHz, bringing the total compute performance up to a rather strong 23.96 teraflops. While teraflops aren't 100% indicative of performance, within a family of cards it's a good way to roughly gauge where it will land in a lineup as long as the memory system scales with the compute power. The memory subsystem featured on the 3070 Ti is strong compared to prior gen offerings in terms of bandwidth, but at the same time is also a bit restrictive at higher resolutions. Running with a 256-bit GDDR6X memory controller, the 8x8GB memory chips on board are clocked at 19 gigabit per second. But with tuning you can get that up to 20 gigabit per second without much in the way of extra heat. While GDDR6X may run hot on the 3080 and 3090, On the 3070 Ti, it's honestly not really an issue, with the memory chips hanging out around 80C when under load. I suspect the fact that this card only features 8 memory chips is helping out, as there is physically less heat being produced. The 3090 on the other hand has 24 memory chips that are sandwiching the PCB, meaning any heat produced by a single chip is theoretically doubled. This isn't happening on the 3070 Ti, thankfully, even when I tweaked my card to run at 20 gigabit per second. But just keep in mind that the further you push the GDDR6X, the hotter it'll run. 8GB though, while fine for 1080 and 1440p, will definitely become restrictive if you decide to turn the resolution up. Smart settings usage can help to alleviate a tight memory budget, but for the resolutions this card is targeted at, it hits a nice sweet spot. For use cases such as scientific compute, the 3070 Ti features 2 FP64 cores per SM, giving us a total of 96 double precision data paths on this card. Each FP32 core is also capable of processing FP16, but not with packed half loads, negating almost any performance improvement brought on by using the smaller data type. The card, while capable of operating on both of these data types, isn't really focused on delivering lower precision compute performance on the shader cores. Instead, if you're looking for strong FP or BFloat 16 performance, then using the 192 Tensor cores on board would probably deliver you more performance in specialized workloads. For APIs or frameworks like PyTorch or TensorFlow, this card is capable of accelerating the calculations, and the Tensor cores on board are beyond fast when it comes to actually running software. The card also features 192 texture mapping units and 96 rasterization operation pipelines. After tweaking, I was able to get the pixel and texture fill rates to just over 185 gigapixels per second and just under 371 gigatexels per second respectively. This beats out the previously reviewed Titan XPascal and pixel rates, but falls behind by a small margin in the texture fill rate department. This really shouldn't worry you, as the 3070 Ti provides plenty of horsepower to properly texture and render objects and scenes at higher resolutions. But the memory bus is what's theoretically holding us back here the most. If you watched my 1070 review, you probably noticed that I said a similar thing about the memory subsystem on that card as well, and I have a feeling that's carried on to the models of today as well. For 1080p and 1440p, the memory subsystem is beyond adequate, and will allow you to reach higher frame rates or push more detail on screen. For 4K though, 256 bits is a little restrictive, especially given that this card only features 4 megs of L2 cache, whereas the upcoming ADA GPUs will feature tens of megabytes of L2. Specifications though can only go so far. You don't want a card that looks good on paper but performs poorly. So let's take a look at some game benchmarks and see how the card scales going from 1080p to 4K. To test the 3070 Ti, I threw it in my personal system. The specifications for this build are suitably mid-range, with an i7-11700K clocked to 5 GHz all-core playing as the heart of our build. This CPU will allow the GPU to take full advantage of PCIe 4.0, fully negating PCIe bandwidth as a potential bottleneck. Paired with our 11700K, we've also got 64 gigs of 3200 megatransfer per second DDR4. This is 100% overkill, but will allow the games to load everything into memory, hopefully helping to prevent stutters where the game is streaming data. All the games were also tested at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K to see how the performance of the card scales as resolution increases. This card isn't technically targeted for 4K gaming, but it's capable of it, so I figured it's something that should be included. If there's any games that you want me to cover in a separate video, let me know in the comments. Without any more to cover, let's dive into the benchmarks. The first game that we'll be taking a look at is the relatively lightweight Apex Legends. This game isn't really known for being particularly hard to run, and it also has a built-in 144 FPS limit, making it a poor title to benchmark. I more so just wanted to experience the game on this graphics card to ensure that everything runs smoothly and there aren't any stuttering issues. Thankfully, after playing the game for 10 minutes at all 3 resolutions tested, there were no issues and the game ran as well as I expected it to. The performance difference between 1080p and 1440p is negligible, but once we make the jump up to 4K, performance starts to dip. It makes sense as you're rendering 4 times as many pixels as 1080p, but at the same time this game runs on a modified version of the source engine, so I would expect it to perform a bit better than an average of 94. Either way, it's really hard to complain because the game remains playable even at these high resolutions. Up next is our first Unreal Engine 4 title, and if you're familiar with it, you know that it can be very demanding at random moments. Ark Survival Evolved, the Dinosaur Simulator Island, seemed to have a massive CPU bottleneck at all resolutions tested. While the FPS did drop when we increased the resolution, it only did so by about 12% at both 1440p and 4K. This game doesn't have a benchmark feature, so I had to get the numbers from just playing the game, and what I did notice is that performance seemed to be more dependent upon the number of AI on screen. With a few of the smaller dinosaurs or fish on screen, everything will be fine, but once the larger ones come out to play, then we run into some stuttering issues, most evident in the 1440p performance. Battlefield 2042, DICE's most recent iteration of the Frostbite engine, scaled with all resolutions tested, unlike Ark. 1080p performance was downright awesome, and if you have a compatible FreeSync monitor, you'll get a killer high refresh rate experience. Jumping up to 1440p lowers the performance pretty heavily, but at the same time remains beyond playable with an average frame rate of 115 FPS. 4K, however, while looking playable based on the 1% low on average, in reality was stuttering, possibly due to the VRAM limitations of the card. This won't be the only game to have VRAM issues at higher resolutions, but this is a decent introduction to the issue. This could potentially be remedied by a 16GB flavor. I honestly wish I could just solder on 16GB memory chips, but the 8GB capacity for this game is restrictive at higher resolutions. This kind of makes me wonder how a 3080 10GB would perform in this game at 4K as well. It might be worth lowering some of the settings on this particular card if you're playing at higher resolutions, or enable DLSS and set it to quality mode. DLSS really deserves its own separate video because the performance profile isn't as simple as scaling resolution. Either way, just know that in this game it works relatively well. It might be worth considering if you want to do some light 4K gaming on this card. The next game is built on CryEngine 3. And even though it's almost 10 years old, it still looks excellent, especially at the high settings we're testing at today. Crysis 3, a Digital Foundry favorite, performed well at all resolutions tested and lacked any stuttering or sudden noticeable dips when running at 4K. I will say that even though it's not the most modern game we could throw into this test suite, its age makes it easy to compare to a wide variety of hardware combinations from over the years. If you want to look at things in terms of similar performance, you need to get a card like a Titan RTX or a tuned 2080 Ti to get similar 4K performance figures in this game. The 2080 Ti may pull ahead in other games depending on a variety of different variables, but in Crysis offers similar performance. For the prices the 3070 Ti can be currently found for, it's not that bad of a deal to pick one up over a 2080 Ti. Our next game, Cyberpunk 2077, is the first game where I'd recommend using DLSS over native rendering if you're targeting 1440p or 4K. Performance at 1080p was beyond acceptable, and if you've got a variable refresh 120Hz display, you'd have an awesome time shooting your way through Night City. 1440p performance, while still perfectly playable, is a bit below where I'd expect a card of this caliber to land, but it could just be that my expectations for this particular game are too high. I do like to call it cyberbug after all. This is mostly confirmed by turning the resolution up to 4K, with performance nearly cutting in half as a result. This begs the question of whether DLSS or FSR are worth using, and as this game supports DLSS, I would generally recommend that implementation simply because the hardware can run it. FSR would do the job too, but this is an Nvidia card, so it's worth mentioning. Based on how this game performs on all hardware, it seems likely that it was just developed with a resolution upscaling algorithm in mind. But looking at the card, its performance really isn't all that bad, especially given that the card uses a 104 die. The still relatively popular and notoriously easy to run game Fortnite ran with an average of over 150 FPS at 1440p and over 200 FPS at 1080p. The 1% lows for both met or exceeded 100 FPS as well, meaning you get a nice competitive edge between the resolutions. 4K though was where we ran into some lower but still very playable frame rates. With an average of 80 FPS and a 1% low of 59, it never drops to unplayable levels, nor does stuttering ever really become an issue, which can't be said for all games we're testing today. Fortnite honestly felt great to play, and there weren't really any instances where I thought to myself, man, what is my frame rate? If these numbers aren't enough though, DLSS can always be used to improve frame rates. And even when set to the quality mode, the frames per second at 4K jumps up to a rather consistent 95 to 105 FPS. If you're seeking a competitive edge on the 3070 Ti, it's also worth lowering the settings further and even enabling the game's performance mode, which would squeeze even more out from the card. Or just keep it in DirectX 12 mode and enable DLSS. Either way, you'll get an awesome experience. The oldie but goldie GTA 5 hit a CPU bottleneck at and below 1440p, with the 1% lows, averages, and maximums looking nearly identical between the runs. 4K remains super playable as well, with there being no stuttering or random dips. Even explosions, which typically tank performance thanks to the bandwidth sapping alpha transparency effects, didn't dip performance that noticeably until I started blowing literally everything up. It's definitely interesting to play through this game recently on this hardware, especially given the GTA 6 leaked gameplay, and it's getting me looking forward to the next gen iteration of this engine on modern hardware. When we get to Red Dead Redemption 2, you'll see a similar recurrence of decent performance at 4K. But focusing on GTA 5, everything ran perfectly, and there are no issues to report while running this game at all resolutions. The most recent entry in the Halo franchise, Infinite, performed well at 1440 and 1080p, but once we got up to 4K, things started to take a step backwards. With an average of 68 FPS and a 1% low of 58, performance may not seem all that poor, but something just felt weird. It wasn't unplayable, but it wasn't smooth either. This can be remedied though by decreasing the resolution scale to just 90%, and a majority of the issues go away. If you enjoy the Master Chief Collection on PC as well, I can say that the games run flawlessly and significantly better at 4K. I don't have a performance graph, but during my playtime with the campaign missions from all the games available, my FPS never dropped below 60 no matter which renderer the game was using. Halo on mouse and keyboard definitely is an awesome way to experience not only Halo Infinite, but all the classics found in the Master Chief Collection. Metro Exodus is still a very graphically demanding and impressive game, but what I find more impressive is how the 3070 Ti handled it like a champ. Even though ray tracing is off, getting an average of 121 FPS and a 1% low of 101 at 4K is very impressive, and makes me comfortable recommending this card to anyone looking to experience Metro at 4K or below. The game ran exceptionally well as well at 1080p with an average of 267 FPS, continuing on with a very strong 187 FPS average at 1440p. There weren't any issues really worth noting, and stuttering was also notably absent. This game seems to run smoothly on a lot of different hardware, but it seems to run exceptionally well on Turing and Ampere. Our next game is the beta flagship title for Infinity Ward's new IW 9.0 engine. The Modern Warfare 2 beta, like most shooters we're testing out today, performed without issue at 1080 and 1440p. With average respective frame rates of 167 and 117 FPS, the 3070 Ti would make for an excellent high refresh rate driver, but at 4K performance starts to run into some issues. Most notably, when I fire a rocket launcher, performance would suddenly dip and stutter. And if I had to guess, I'd suspect that the smoke particle effects are tapping out the 256-bit memory bus. The thermite grenades also cause some performance issues, especially when they're in close proximity to the camera. Once again, bringing up the fact that the GPU on this card is bandwidth starved at higher resolutions. To fix all these issues at 4K, turning DLSS on at the quality setting made everything much smoother, and brought the average up to around 100 FPS. The 1% lows also improved, but what I'd look for in a competitive shooter like this is consistency in performance. I'd take a flat 80 FPS over a jittery and bouncing frame rate, but I know not everyone is like that. Settings could also be turned down, especially particle effects, and that would definitely help with the issues experienced during testing. Overwatch 2, the sequel to the infamously easy to run Overwatch, performed nearly identically on average between all resolutions, indicating a very hard CPU bottleneck. Even the maximum frame rates actually increased with resolution, which kind of doesn't make sense, but at the same time could be some sort of variance that occurred between games. Either way, performance was more impacted by your CPU's raw horsepower over your GPU once you get to this class of hardware. The 3070 Ti is honestly complete overkill if you want to put together an Overwatch system, and you could get by with much cheaper hardware. The game at ultra settings and over 200 FPS really was fun to look at and play, and there were no issues with stuttering at any resolution or test configuration. Up next is another Unreal Engine 4 title, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds is still a very popular battle royale, and for what it is, it's relatively lightweight. The 3070 Ti absolutely crushed 1080 and 1440p, with an average of 274 and 213 FPS respectively. The high settings in this game might also be turned down for competitive play. I remember when this game first came out and lowering the graphics settings to make foliage disappear was a thing. If you end up going with some of the lower settings, performance would look even better, especially at 4K. It might not be a competitive 120 FPS, but to win some chicken dinners it's more than adequate, with an average of 107 FPS and a 1% low of 78. If you're looking to use this card for 1440p gaming, it provides exceptional performance that would allow you to remain competitive, even at the higher settings that we're using today. It was fun to play this game again, and I might do so on this hardware after I'm done with this review. Up next is a pure ray tracing game, just to showcase the RTX namesake in at least one title. Quake 2 RTX, while not really a game that you would sit down and play in 2022, offers an awesome implementation of ray trace lighting and reflections. It allows us to stress the ray tracing cores found in Ampere, and there's an odd performance quirk. I'm suspicious of a CPU bottleneck at 1440p and below just because the performance difference between it and 1080p was negligible. I retested this 3 times and got a similar spread each time, so there has to be something going on. Either way, with an average of over 110 FPS at 1440p and 1080p, the game looks excellent and runs well. Once we turned the resolution up to 4K though, we started to see some issues. DLSS is also available in this game, meaning performance can be helped, but the extent to which it can be varies depending on the scene. Sometimes it'll get up to the high 90s and other times it'll tank to the low 40s. It's inconsistent, but it does help. So it might be worth looking into if you're planning on running this game on your prospective 3070 Ti. Rainbow Six Siege is a very popular esport game that originally came out when Maxwell 2.0 was still king. In the 3 generations since, they've made tons of improvements, to the point where the 3070 Ti can run this game at competitive frame rates at any resolution without breaking a sweat. We're at over 340 FPS on average at 1080p, with a 1% low of 275, and 234 FPS on average at 1440p with a 1% low of 200. 4K, while coming in with an average of 117 FPS and a 1% low of 100, these frame rates would actually allow for rather competitive play even at higher resolutions. There isn't really anything else to say about the game beyond the fact that it seems to scale linearly with resolution, and it ran exceptionally smoothly during my game sessions. The next game in today's suite is the current gen Rage title. Red Dead Redemption 2, while not achieving performance as high as GTA 5 at higher resolutions, actually provided far more performance at resolutions lower than 4K than the previous gen title. I've gotten a few comments explaining GTA 5's weird engine frame rate limit, and thankfully that seems to have been pushed up to around 200 FPS in this title. The 3070 Ti reaches this limit at 1080p, but in all reality that's not that big of a deal because the frame rates are so high. At 4K though, I would say that it's worth lowering some of the settings, specifically the grass detail slider. At 4K, the game only uses about 6.5 gigs of VRAM, so there still is room for higher resolution textures. Even if you were to switch every setting to low, the game would still honestly look great, and if you're not satisfied with performance at these settings, you can always enable DLSS. Even set to the quality setting, the performance will jump up by about 15 FPS at 4K. The game looks very good and plays well, thanks to Rockstar's fixes to the range engine from GTA 5 that caused issues at higher frame rates. This game is a blast on the 3070 Ti. Our last game is soon to be outdated, but I suspect the performance profile will be very similar moving into the 2.0 version. Call of Duty Warzone, built on the IW 8.0 engine, performed well when running at 1080 and 1440p. With an average of 171 FPS and a 1% low of 102 at 1080p, and a 1440p average and 1% low of 121 and 90 FPS respectively, performance is excellent and beyond competitive. 4K performance, while playable, is below the competitive standard that a lot of players look for in an esports title. And as a result, I'd look into DLSS to attain the higher refresh rates. Settings can also be lowered to raise the frame rates. But with this card on my main build, I don't ever have any problem with the performance offered, and will usually just turn on DLSS to help performance. Warzone was playable no matter the resolution we tested at, but to keep the competitive edge at 4K, a resolution scaler is required. Overall, the 3070 Ti proves to be a powerful graphics card for 1440p and even dipping into some 4K gaming. When Nvidia marketed the 3070 family as 2080 Ti competitors, they weren't kidding, because this card provides better performance than said card. Pricing though for these cards new is still rather high, but on the used market things are starting to come down. For about $500 at the time of writing this review, I'd rather recommend the 3070 as it comes in at around $100 less, and honestly doesn't perform significantly different. I don't have a 3070 on hand, but based on other reviews that are available comparing the two cards, the Ti model is roughly 7% faster on average, making the extra money difficult to justify. If you're looking to spend between $500 to $600, or what I'd call 3070 Ti money, I would recommend jumping up to the 3080 for about $50 more, as that card will provide roughly 18% more performance than the 3070 Ti. If you're trying to decide a good value GPU, the base 3070 is clearly the winner, and will continue to be so as long as there's roughly $100 between the base and Ti models. Though if you're watching this review because you're looking at a 3070 Ti that you're considering getting, just be aware that it's an awesome card, but with great graphics power comes great literal power. You'll need at least a 600 watt power supply to run the card comfortably, as well as decent airflow. When looking at performance, it offers amazing frame rates that's perfectly representative of Ampere as a generation, though it's not an alternative to the 3080 in the sense that the 1070 Ti was a good substitute for a 1080, meaning this card sits way closer to the 3070 than the 3080 in terms of horsepower. I didn't discuss creator benchmarks such as DaVinci Resolve render times or Blender render times, because to be honest, it's more than enough to edit and render at 1080p, 1440p, or even some light 4K. I would definitely recommend the Quadro variant of this GPU as it offers double the VRAM if you're a professional looking to make money off your system, but for the average Joe, this card provides more than enough performance in a package that's not oppressively difficult to cool or feed power. Keep an eye out for the 3070 Ti, because sooner or later one may present itself as too irresistible to pass up. So thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and click the bell icon so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. I appreciate the people who stuck around during this sort of kind of absence that's been going on, but let me know in the comments, what do you think of the 3070 Ti? What are your initial impressions, and what do you think of the performance? Personally, it kind of exceeds my expectations in some ways and kind of misses them in others, but I don't think it's that bad of a card like some people made it out to be. But either way, thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.